Mick Jagger spent 60 years building something that couldn't be replicated, a presence so charged with danger and intelligence that it became the standard every rock and roll frontman got measured against, whether they liked it or not. Rolling Stone magazine called it magnetism. People who worked with him called it control. What it actually was, stripped of all the mythology, was a man who understood better than anyone alive that rock music ran on identity, and that identity, once borrowed, felt exactly like theft. Most people assume someone operating at that level would be beyond personal grudges, too busy, too celebrated, too high above the noise to care what other performers were doing in adjacent rooms. That assumption was spectacularly wrong. And the evidence has been sitting in backstage conversations, buried magazine interviews, and eyewitness accounts for decades without ever quite breaking into the mainstream story of who Mick Jagger really was when the cameras went off and the stage lights died. 5 men pushed him past the cool indifference he performed so reliably in public and into something that looked, sounded, and functioned exactly like hatred. What follows is who they were, what they triggered in him, and why not one of these conflicts ever found its way to any kind of resolution. Not a handshake, not a kind word in an interview, not even a mutual agreement to leave each other alone. Steven Tyler was the first name on that list, and the reason starts with something most people find charming, but Jagger found quietly unbearable. The observation that the 2 men looked and moved and performed like variations of the same original blueprint. By the mid-70s, Aerosmith's rise had made Tyler unavoidable, and every journalist who got 5 minutes with Mick seemed to arrive carrying the same question with the same delighted energy, as if they were the first person alive to notice it. Does Steven Tyler remind you of yourself? People close to the Rolling Stones described the effect that question had on Jagger in consistent terms across every account. The eye roll came first, then the jaw tightening, then a comment muttered just loud enough to be heard. Remind me? He's practically auditioning to be me. What nobody expected was how fast that low simmer would become something public and irreversible. The night that happened was a New York industry party in 1976, and by every account from people in that room, Tyler walked in doing everything Jagger had been doing since the 60s. The scarf-wrapped microphone stand, the loose physicality, the theatrical confidence that consumed every room it entered. He spotted Mick, moved toward him with genuine warmth, and opened his arms like they were reconnecting after years apart. Jagger didn't move, didn't smile, and didn't extend a hand. He leaned in close enough that only Tyler could hear, and delivered it quietly and without hesitation. You're not inspired by me, Steven. You're copying me. The room went silent, not because it was quiet, but because something in the atmosphere changed, and people who weren't anywhere near either man felt it shift. Tyler froze long enough for everyone nearby to understand that whatever greeting he'd prepared had just collapsed completely. A year later, when Aerosmith performed on national television in 1977, Jagger reportedly watched from a couch with his arms crossed before the first chorus even landed. And when Tyler hit his signature scream and moved into his hip swagger, Mick stood up and said to no one in particular, "That's me, if I'd been put through a photocopier." Brutal, specific, and delivered without any trace of humor. Aerosmith's commercial comeback in the 80s made the tension worse rather than better, and when MTV asked Jagger about Walk This Way, he dismissed it in 5 words: old tricks in new packaging. Tyler kept reaching across the gap over the years, kept attempting to build something that resembled mutual respect, and Jagger maintained the same posture through all of it. Polite enough when cameras were pointing at him, completely dismissive in every other setting. No reconciliation came. None was ever close. To Mick, Tyler wasn't a competitor worth engaging on equal terms. He was a mirror held up at the wrong angle, showing a version of Jagger that someone else was selling to stadiums full of people. And that specific offense, the idea that his identity had been borrowed and monetized without acknowledgement, never stopped disturbing him. John Bon Jovi arrived on Jagger's list through a different kind of irritation, one rooted less in imitation and more in everything Mick believed rock music should never be allowed to become. People who worked around Jagger in the late 80s describe his reaction to Bon Jovi's name as a reflex, automatic and identical every single time. The eye roll, the smirk, the slow head shake, and then a comment that made whoever was in the room uncomfortable enough to look somewhere else. The blow-dried hair bothered him. The polished chorus hooks bothered him. The photogenic smile, permanent and camera-ready across every interview and awards appearance, bothered him at a level that felt almost philosophical rather than personal. Living on a Prayer was looping on radios across America. Stadiums were filling in every city the band visited, and magazines were naming John the new face of American rock. And that's when Jagger's take came out flat. American rock? That's pop with guitars. The first direct encounter happened backstage at the 1989 MTV Video Music Awards, and by every account it produced one of the coldest exchanges either man's crew had witnessed that year. Bon Jovi approached with the confidence of someone who had just sold out arenas across 3 continents, and extended his hand toward what he expected would be a warm exchange with a legend who had inspired him. Jagger looked at him the way someone examines a display they don't intend to buy from, and stepped aside without responding. Only after Bon Jovi had walked away did Mick turn to Ronnie Wood and say at full volume, "Didn't realize rock stars came pre-packaged now." Everyone in earshot caught it, and the line traveled through the building on its own momentum. A month later, during early Steel Wheels planning sessions, someone placed Bon Jovi's record-breaking tour numbers on the table, and half-jokingly suggested the Stones might consider a similar approach to attract younger audiences. Jagger closed the folder without putting it down carefully, and snapped back without any pause. "I'd rather quit than sound like that." His Q magazine interview sealed whatever goodwill had remained, describing Bon Jovi's catalog without concealing what he thought of it. Greeting card rock, sweet messages, simple riffs. When both attended Clive Davis's pre-Grammy party in 2013, people in the room noticed they stayed on opposite ends of the ballroom the entire night. No eye contact, no nod, nothing exchanged across the distance between them. Robert Plant triggered something older and more complicated in Jagger, because Plant wasn't borrowing anything from him and wasn't trying to. Plant built his own mythology inside Led Zeppelin from the ground up, and the threat that posed to Mick's settled sense of where he stood at the top of rock music's hierarchy was something he couldn't manage the way he managed the others. People present at Triton Studios in 1971 describe a specific evening where Plant had just delivered a vocal take in the adjacent room, the kind of performance that stopped conversations mid-sentence and made people listen through walls without deciding to. Someone, badly misjudging the mood in the room, joked that Mick should try singing like that sometime. Jagger's face shifted in a way that people still remember clearly. And minutes later, loud enough for several people to catch every word, he said, "That prehistoric wailing? Not my style." Plant heard the comment and assumed, generously, that Jagger was being playful. He wasn't, and through the rest of that decade, as music magazines built comparative headlines and journalists made careers staging Plant against Jagger for the title of the greatest rock frontman alive, the irritation matured into something consistent and unresolved. After Led Zeppelin shattered attendance records in 1973, a reporter asked Mick directly what he thought about Plant drawing larger crowds than the Stones, and he answered without hesitating, "Guess volume sells these days. Loud doesn't mean good." Plant responded publicly with a composure that implied something far less composed in private, while insiders reported he described Mick as terrified of change in more candid settings. The two eventually settled into a kind of formal coexistence at awards shows across the following decades. Quick acknowledgments across rooms, no real conversation. The performance of mutual respect with nothing genuine running underneath it. Joe Strummer came at Jagger from a direction none of the others had tried, because Strummer wasn't interested in competing for audiences, imitating anyone's stage presence, or claiming the same territory. When the Clash built their name inside the punk rock scene during the late 70s, Strummer wanted to dismantle the existing music industry hierarchy entirely, and Jagger's name was the one he kept returning to as he worked at dismantling it. The quote reached Mick within hours of its publication. "The Stones are millionaire tax exiles pretending to be rebels." One of the Stones' crew described watching Jagger read it, the way he folded the newspaper slowly after finishing, and the quiet, flat way his voice came out when he finally spoke. "Who does this boy think he is?" The Rock Against Racism concert in 1978 put them in the same physical space backstage, and Strummer approached, not to apologize or de-escalate, but simply to introduce himself. Mick looked him over the way someone examines something unexpected left on a doorstep, then walked past after saying, "Come talk when you've had a hit in America." Witnesses say Strummer's jaw tightened so hard he could barely form sentences for the rest of that evening. What followed, across 1977 to 1979, was a sustained run of interviews where Strummer repeatedly described the Stones as old men playing at Revolution and rock aristocracy, and Jagger tracked every single comment. It was the first time someone younger had publicly stripped the band's credibility as outsiders and rebels, and when Rolling Stone finally asked Mick about punk bands, his response was measured and devastating. "3 chords and a slogan don't make you a revolutionary." When Strummer died in 2002, Jagger's public tribute functioned as a final, carefully constructed closing statement. He believed in what he was doing, even if it wasn't particularly sophisticated. No warmth, no generosity toward the memory of someone who had died young. 2 men who found nothing in each other worth respecting from their first encounter to the last thing either one said about the other. Chad Kroeger was a different category entirely, and the contempt Jagger directed at him had less to do with personal history and more to do with what Nickelback represented to everything he believed rock and roll existed to protect. The irritation began the moment the band's name appeared alongside the Rolling Stones on a festival lineup, and it escalated faster than any of the other conflicts because Kroeger never actually challenged Jagger the way Robert Plant or Joe Strummer had. He simply occupied a space Mick felt should be defended against exactly the kind of music Nickelback produced. At a German music festival in 2006, a journalist mentioned the band to Jagger with the casual energy of someone making small talk between sets, and Mick answered without blinking, "Fun? I don't consider what they do to be in the same universe as us." The real rupture came in 2008, when Kroeger publicly names the Rolling Stones as a major influence, and that's when something in Jagger snapped. Bernard Fowler watched Mick read the magazine, watched him close it without setting it down gently, and heard what followed. Influence of what? Selling cliches. Nobody in the room responded. A BBC interview in 2013 produced what may be the most deliberate articulation of Jagger's contempt on this subject, when he addressed modern rock bands without naming Kroeger, but made the target unmistakable. When groups like that become the face of rock, it's no wonder kids abandon the genre. And then the 2017 Rolling Stone interview removed whatever remained of diplomatic cover, when Mick settled on a word nobody anticipated him using. Not bland, not boring. Harmful. Harmful to the entire spirit of rock and roll. Kroeger never responded across any interview in any year, and people close to him say he avoids Jagger's name the way someone avoids revisiting a fire they accidentally started and couldn't extinguish. Jagger has not softened by any measurable amount, and based on everything he has said and done across 5 decades, that is precisely how he intends it to stay. What ties these 5 conflicts together isn't rage or ego alone, though both were present in considerable amounts across every one of them. What ties them together is Jagger's lifelong conviction that rock music had a specific shape and a specific spirit, and that people who diluted it or imitated it or reduced it to something safe and commercial were doing genuine damage to something that mattered. Whether that conviction was principled or self-serving depended entirely on who you asked. Steven Tyler thought it was self-serving. Joe Strummer thought the whole premise was fraudulent, coming from a man living in tax exile. Chad Kroeger apparently thought it was safer not to engage with the premise at all. Robert Plant and John Bon Jovi developed their own quiet accommodations with the distance Jagger maintained. None of them changed his mind, and none of them softened the posture he held from the mid-70s through to the present day. The feud stayed cold because Mick wanted them cold, because warmth would have implied that the people he held in contempt had earned something from him that he was never prepared to give. Identity is the one currency rock and roll has always run on, and Mick Jagger spent his entire career making certain that nobody else got to control his.